as told by still astounded Esme Povirk. That's me. I use she, her pronouns or any other pronouns. Been working for Code Weavers since 2008, which is a long time. I am the maintainer of Wine Mono and now somehow the maintainer of Framework Mono. Yeah, so I am going to be going into a lot of history, stuff that happened before I was really involved. I was in high school and college, so I'm kind of relying on public records. I may get some stuff wrong, I apologize. I do have a document with more detailed notes and references that'll be available somewhere. I'm sure, like maybe the WineConf wiki page. And if anything, if you are confused, then there's probably like 3 other people who are confused. So please ask me to clarify. So going back to kind of the start of things, I didn't really go back to the history of .NET framework, but I guess that was around 2000, 2001, I don't know. But so .NET framework, for anyone not familiar, is a bit like Java and the JVM. There are some object-oriented programming languages, C#, VB.NET. They compile down to a bytecode that is CPU neutral, and there is a runtime that executes the bytecode. And then there are also class libraries that are also presumably written in C#. They're closed source in Microsoft, so I don't know. Apparently after .NET Framework came out, Miguel de Casa and other people in Simian, this was a company working on the GNOME desktop, they were very impressed with it. They wanted to use it to build applications for GNOME a little bit more easily. And kind of over the next couple of years, they put together a runtime and a compiler and class libraries, all of this at the same time, all kind of like sort of patching it together for Microsoft stuff and building some stuff on Windows with .NET Framework until all of it came together and they were able to like actually build everything on Linux and bootstrap everything, which is very amazing to me how quickly they did that. And then Novell bought the company, which is not super important to the story, but it just explains why I'm going to be talking about Novell later. And in 2004, they had a 1.0 release. And after that, there were some Linux applications coming out that used Mono. Banshee Tomboy, which was a note-taking app. I think this didn't really catch on for some reason, but they were doing it. And I am also going to be talking about the history of some of the stuff with running Windows applications, which was kind of going along on a parallel track. That kind of started out with implementation of Windows Forms, which was a GUI toolkit that .NET applications at that time mostly used on Windows. They first did it based on GTK, and that didn't really work because they're completely different. So they made it based on Wine, because WinForms is user 32. Wine has a user 32. And they hackily embedded Wine into Mono processes, which didn't really work, and they had lots of problems, and it broke all of the time. So they gave up on that, and they made a pure C# implementation based on X11 or Win32. There were different backends. And I understand a lot of the motivation of that is Windows compatibility. Then in 2006, Wine started to, I think there's a patch from Hans actually that like, when you run a .NET executable, it would just run, so like you run hello world.exe, and Wine would then run mono.exe, hello world.exe. And then it prints out hello world from the Windows mono that you, as a user, would have had to install separately. And it really barely worked at all. It didn't really run anything very well, but point being, people were working on compatibility pretty much since the start of the project. So around 2009, the mono people kind of started to shift their focus. That started with Mono Touch, which was a commercial product out of Novell that let you use .NET to target iOS. So if you're a .NET developer, you can now use C# or VB.NET or whatever you use to make applications for an iPhone, which I think is really great. I think that's cool. And then they did kind of the same thing with Android. And then a bunch of stuff happened. Attachmate bought Novell, and then they laid off the mono people, and then the mono people started their own company, and then Attachmate licensed all of their old stuff to the new company. So pretty much nothing changed except now they're called Xamarin. And they released bindings for Mac, and kind of the way it worked out at the end of all this is that you could be a .NET developer and have basically one backend code base that is .NET, and you could just write for pretty much every platform using .NET if you bought Xamarin, because it is a separate commercial product. So over in compatibility land, around the same time, about 2010, actually January of 2010, there was a company meeting at Codeweavers where we were discussing .NET framework and issues we were having running the .NET framework. And mostly that discussion centered on like the Microsoft .NET framework that had a redistributable exe that we would run in Wine. And I kind of brought up, I'm not sure how long that's going to be a viable solution. We really should have our own thing for running .NET applications, so I was told to fix it, naturally. So one of the first things I did there was, instead of running mono.exe, hello world.exe, we would load mono.dll, and we would tell it to run hello world.exe, which actually was a big improvement, because when a program asks, okay, what is the command line of the current process, it doesn't get confused by it being mono.exe and then there being this other exe in there. So that was actually pretty important. And then a couple of years later, I kind of came to the conclusion that, okay, we can't really use the upstream build of Mono very well, because it kind of expects to be separate from the operating system, and we kind of are the operating system, and we need to be cooperating instead of trying to do the same thing over each other. So I had to fork it to make some changes there so that Mono would do a little bit less. and also to bring in some other libraries that we needed that weren't part of Mono. So back to what was happening with Xamarin, what they were now called. 2013, they released a new version of their product that integrated with Visual Studio, so now you can do all of your .NET development for all of your platforms in Visual Studio, which I still think is really cool. This is awesome. And then Mono and this is kind of a trend of Mono and Microsoft starting to get together. So Mono starts bringing in some MIT licensed code that Microsoft was putting out. And then actually in 2016, Microsoft just bought them, which makes a lot of sense because then they can say that then they have this technology that targets every platform with a great object-oriented programming language. And they just made that part of Visual Studio. And then they said, okay, we don't like having the separate Mono and Xamarin thing, so we're gonna combine all of it together, and we're gonna do that in .NET 5, which is all gonna be open source. That didn't really work out. It took until .NET 6, but they still did it. And they lived happily ever after. The end. So over in Wineland, Microsoft was releasing a bunch of MIT licensed stuff, and they released actually these two libraries, Windows Forms and WPF, as open source, and these are big complex libraries. WinForms we had, but it didn't really work. WPF we didn't have at all, so I quickly imported those into WineMono. I say quickly, it was like years of effort, but that's still pretty fast, I think. I mean, they also took years to actually do the release, to be fair. Like, they initially released WPF and it was incomplete and we couldn't use it, so it took a few more years to even get all of the code. And I also added FNA as a wrapper for another library. FNA is open source project that has nothing to do with Microsoft other than it's re-implementing a Microsoft library. And also around this time, for other reasons, I had a lot of time to work on games that were using .NET and a lot of access to games, which helped a lot with WineMono's compatibility, and I think it's gotten pretty good. I think it runs most of the things, which is also kind of amazing to me. Anyway, so back to the Mono story that apparently hasn't ended. And I think it's interesting. I didn't realize this until I put all the dates together. So like right after they released .NET 5 and they had announced the intention of bringing everything together into the .NET runtime, they also released Mono 6.12, which it would turn out would be the last feature release of Mono that they would do. It would kind of just, it's kind of going on a downhill trend from there. Most people would be served pretty well by .NET. I still think .NET is really great, but there were some shortcomings. It broke compatibility with .NET Framework, so it can't run .NET Framework applications. Actually, this is why .NET Framework still has to be shipped in Windows to run those programs. It doesn't have the Windows Forms GUI toolkit on Linux, even though Mono has had that for a very long time. It doesn't support 32-bit ARM CPUs, which some people are still using. And as long as the hardware is still working and is good, I think they should still be able to use it. And I don't know, maybe this is a nitpicky thing. Maybe I'm the only one who cares about this, but like, with .NET Framework, you could build an exe, and your exe could run on Windows, and it could run on Mono, and you can't do that with current .NET. With current .NET, you kind of have to make a separate build for every platform that you're targeting. Also, this might also just be a personal qualm with .NET, but it seems to be really hard to build. It's pretty complicated, and by default, I think it like downloads a bunch of stuff. And with Mono, you just download a tarball and it's configure and make. So I'm kind of more of a fan of that. Right, so the Mono people kind of shifted their focus to .NET, and they kind of abandoned Mono slowly. Like, the pull requests on GitHub stopped being reviewed and merged, and like, they were bringing in some of them, but it was very frustrating to a lot of people who still wanted to use Mono, and especially the people who are interested in Windows Forms, and we're still writing code and improving Windows Forms, and none of that was getting in. So, this isn't on the slide, but in January of 2024, there was a commenter on a GitHub issue who said, hey, maybe Esme or Jonathan Chambers from Unity 3D would be interested in taking up maintainership of the project. And I kind of said, okay. I don't know who I would talk to actually like take over, and they probably wouldn't give me what I wanted for that anyway, which is basically full control of the project. So I'm just going to fork it on GitLab, and that's going to be an unofficial successor, and I will bring in like, you know, whatever contributions people want to make, and I'll review them. And then in April, I got an email from Jeff Schwartz from Microsoft. Apparently, there was a reorganization, and he was given, like, Mono became his. And he kind of said, well, okay, we can't really take care of this, so we're just going to reach out to all of the current stakeholders of Mono and figure out what to do. And he did. He brought up the possibility of me like maintaining it, and just to see if I was interested, and like not actually an offer that I would be able to do it. I said no, and then I kind of talked it over with Alexander and some Codeweavers management, and they were all very supportive, and I came back and said, yeah, I'm interested. And I guess it took until August to like talk to everyone, make sure it was okay, and like get everything sorted out so that they could announce that the Mono project would now be taken care of by WineHQ and give us absolutely nothing other than their blessing. And of course, I had already been working on that, so the repo on GitLab was already there. And then in March, I released a new feature release of Mono. I changed the name to Framework Mono because there's also Wine Mono and Mono VM, and I wanted there to be something to distinguish them. Mono VM being the remaining tiny part of Mono that still exists in current.NET. It's basically just the runtime, a heavily modified version of the runtime, and none of the class libraries. They've diverged a lot. So where we're at now, Framework Mono is working on some set of common desktop platforms, and system.windows.forms still being developed. There is another project called core.system.windows.forms that is basically taking it out of Mono and bringing it into native.NET as a library. And we are sort of collaborating with them. There's a developer who's been doing a lot of WinForms work called Alexander Kuklev. And I'm really happy about that. And we're kind of trying to keep these two projects in sync and working together on that, which is a nice change from how a lot of early Mono stuff went. And we have continuous integration on GitLab for specifically the Linux platform and AMD 64. A lot of stuff still missing, like from the transfer. We don't have any official binary packages. I would really like some help. Mostly the thing that I can use is how the heck do I build these? And a lot of the like automation and actually building them is like, if I know how to do it, I can take care of that part. And I'm sure WineHQ has infrastructure to host them. There's the monoproject.com website, which hosts their wiki, and we don't really have a replacement for that. There is a Git repository. In theory, we could probably host a copy. Someone just needs to do that. And there's also the downloads website that we don't have mirrored. I worry about how long that's going to continue to exist, and I would like to have all of that stuff captured so we don't lose it. And I would really like to see the continuous integration on a lot more of the platforms that Mono supports. So stuff that I'm working on now, I'm still working on WinForms, bugs keep coming in, new contributions keep coming in. There are people still using it, so I'm going to keep working on that. I am trying to replace, so Mono's cryptography uses boring SSL, which doesn't have a stable API, and now it depends on Go, so we can't really upgrade it anymore, and that I really don't like that being the case for a cryptography library. So I would like to be able to replace it with like OpenSSL or LibreSSL or something. And Mono targets a lot of other, it historically targeted a lot of other Linux architectures. So there were 32-bit ARM architectures, there was PowerPC, there's ARM 64-bit, and I would like to have all of that working. It, as far as I can tell, does not right now. So when I find the time to do that, I'm going to try to fix all of those bugs. That is what I had to talk about. So in theory, I am ahead of when my talk is supposed to end, but I have been talking 25 minutes, so I don't know if I have time for questions or not. I guess
you have
that's
time for questions.
up to
If people have questions, please ask.
Stefan?
I'm still confused as like, what is .NET? What is .NET Framework? And there's a version 4, 5, 6? Not your fault, it's Microsoft's fault, but it's all confusing.
So, okay, .NET Framework is a closed source runtime and class libraries and compiler and all of that stuff that ships as part of Windows and has a redistributable library. .NET Core was an open source fork of the same code base that went from version 1 to 3, and then .NET 5 is their unified version that is based on .NET Core and was supposed to bring in all of the stuff that .NET Framework does and all of this mono stuff and just bring everything together. So that is why it is just .NET now, because they thought, oh, no one needs to distinguish, like, we don't need a distinguisher between these. It's all just .NET now. And we see how that worked out. Everyone is confused.
I thought I ran some .NET application at some point that said .NET 5 or something on it, and it spewed out some mono error messages. Is that because I was accidentally using Wine's mono replacement, or? But I thought I saw it.
I would have to see the error message to have any idea what.
So at some point I had this idea that Microsoft switched internally to mono, but maybe that was wrong. Oh, on some platforms.
Yeah, but there's also stuff like Unity.
Maybe it was Unity. Maybe I forgot which application it was.
Okay, well, I would need to see more details to tell you anything about that. Owen?
Are there any particular areas in like the class library that Wine Mono or Mono Framework Mono don't currently implement that .NET Framework still implements? I know WPF was a big one for a while, but that's
yeah. The question was anything in .NET Framework that Wine Mono doesn't implement. Nothing major. There's a few pieces of WPF that we're still missing. There's rich text stuff that we don't have that I think actually Brendan is working on. But for the most part, it's pretty complete at this point. Yes.
Why is also not working with Wine Mono? I've heard it's because of that also out library, which is older, and which is also glad you changed the name because when searching up one, it brings up a completely irrelevant thing.
I think the question was about Oso, which is a rhythm game. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know there's a bug. I don't remember what the state of that bug is. Anna, I think. Sure. Oh.
Sure. How different are Wine Mono and Framework Mono right now? And are there like plans to kind of merge it together again now that it's under the same management?
The question was how different are Wine Mono and Framework Mono, and are there plans to merge them together? I would say so like apart from the parts that we just have entirely separate that we bring in, like WinForms, they haven't diverged all of that much, and I would like to bring in a lot of the Wine Mono changes, the ones that make sense, to Framework Mono. There are always going to be a few differences. There are a few things that can't, that have to be different for Wine, but that should be a very small diff. Stefan?
I just want to forward a question from Alex Henry on the WineConf Matrix chat. Does Framework Mono run applications built for any version of .NET 2.0, 3.0, 4.5, blah, 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 blah.
So Framework Mono will run anything that's built for .NET Framework. It has some support for .NET 5 when they were kind of like trying to figure out how to bring everything together. Anything beyond that, it won't. But it's mostly focused on .NET Framework at this point.
Let's make this the last question because we're running a bit late.
Okay.
Is there anything from .NET upstream mono, the full version, that we can bring into framework mono now, or is it just completely diverged because of the changes that the framework has had ever since?
The question was, is there anything from the .NET upstream, the parts of Mono they still have that we can bring into Framework Mono? Actually, that was one of the few places where the Mono people were keeping up with development. They were, like, as they were working on their fork of the Mono runtime in .NET, they were bringing in those changes to Framework Mono, and they, as I understand it, eventually stopped because the code bases just diverged too much and they couldn't do it anymore.
All right, great. I mean, I think if there are more questions, we're about to have a break, so we can ask Esme and Jason in the break. So the break room is straight out the back and then left, follow the crowd. We are running a little bit behind time, so let's try and get back here by 11:10. So that gives us 25 minutes, I think. One more. If the guys giving the next talk or the ARM people giving the next talk could set up before that, that would be great.